There's 19 of them. Her neighbor's voice cracked through the phone static. Grace, did you hear me? 19 bodies on Route 46. In this storm. Grace Turner didn't answer. She was already pulling on her coat. She was 68 years old, widowed, broke, driving a car the heater was slowly abandoning. She had no medical training, no rescue equipment, no reason on earth to drive back into a whiteout blizzard on a road that was trying to kill everything on it. But she had already seen them. 19 shapes in the dark, sprawled across the frozen shoulder. And the only thought her mind produced was simple and absolute. Not on my road. Not tonight. If this story moves you, please subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that night, because nothing about what happened was small. Grace Turner had been talking to Peter again. She did that sometimes, talked out loud to her late husband while she drove, the way some people pray or hum to themselves without realizing it. 3 years gone and she still reached for him in the dark, still turned to say something funny at dinner before remembering the chair across from her was empty. Grief, she had learned, does not move in a straight line. It doubles back. It ambushes you in grocery store aisles and quiet Tuesday evenings when the wind comes off the mountain and rattles the windows just the way it used to when he was alive. I know, Pete, she murmured, both hands tight on the wheel of her 2004 Chevy Malibu, the one he had insisted on keeping even when the transmission started making that sound. I'm going slow, I promise. The heater was running on its last prayer. It pushed out just enough warmth to keep the windshield clear, but Grace could feel the cold seeping through the door seams, wrapping itself around her ankles, climbing up her legs. She had on her heavy coat, the green one Peter had bought her the Christmas before he passed, and she had tucked a wool blanket around her lap, like a woman who had learned long ago that you don't wait for comfort to come to you. You build it out of whatever's at hand. Route 46 in February was not a road for the faint of heart. It cut through the lower passes of the Bitterroot Range like a gray scar, narrow and unlit for long stretches, the kind of road that made newcomers nervous and made longtime Montana residents say things like, "She knows what she is." Grace had driven it hundreds of times. She knew every long curve, every dip where black ice liked to collect, every mile marker. She knew the road, and the road knew her. But tonight the road was different. The blizzard had come in faster than forecast. The Weather Service had called for moderate accumulation, 6 to 8 inches, nothing the county plows couldn't handle by morning. What arrived instead was a wall. Visibility dropped to 50 feet, then 30, then less. The wind pushed the snow sideways in long white sheets that made the headlights nearly useless. Grace had made the decision to push through rather than pull over, because pulling over on Route 46 in a whiteout meant risking someone sliding into the back of you, and she had made that call a dozen times before, and always been fine. She was 4 miles from home when she saw the first shape. She almost missed it entirely. Her brain processed it first as a fallen tree, something dark and irregular against the white shoulder of the road. But then she saw the second shape, and the third, and then her headlights swept across the full width of the shoulder, and she realized with a lurching, stomach-dropping horror that she was looking at people. Her foot hit the brake before her mind had fully caught up to what she was seeing. The Malibu fishtailed slightly, recovered, stopped. Grace Turner sat in the idling car for exactly 3 seconds. Then she got out. The cold hit her like a wall, like something physical and intentional, like the weather was trying to push her back into the car. The wind screamed across the open stretch of road with the kind of force that steals your voice before you can use it. Grace pulled her coat tight at the collar, took one step, then another, crunching through snow that came up past her ankles. "Hello?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Hello, is anybody?" "Over here." The voice was low, ragged, barely audible over the wind. Male, coming from just beyond the largest shape, which she could now see was a motorcycle lying on its side, half buried in a drift. "Over here, please, we need help." Grace moved toward the voice. The man was big, not just tall but broad, the kind of build that made you think of load-bearing walls. He was wearing a leather vest over a heavy jacket, both crusted with ice, and he was sitting with his back against the guardrail, with another man's head in his lap. One enormous hand pressed against the man's neck, like he was trying to hold something in. His face was a mask of ice crystals, and what Grace realized with a faint shock was grief. Raw, open, terrified grief. The kind you see on the face of someone who is watching something precious slip away and knows it. "He's not breathing right," the big man said. His teeth were chattering so hard she could barely understand him. "He took the worst of it when we went down. I can't get him warm, and I can't leave him. And I've been sitting here I don't know how long." "How many of you are there?" Grace asked. She was already kneeling, already pulling her blanket from where she'd somehow carried it out of the car without realizing, already pressing it around the man on the ground. 19. A pause. 18 others. Some of them are up the road. We were riding together and the road, it came up so fast. "Okay," Grace said. She said it the way she used to say it to her students in the cafeteria when a child spilled something and was starting to cry. Calm, certain, no drama, just the word itself like a hand on the shoulder. "Okay, I'm going to get help. I'm going to get all of you help. What's your name?" "Darnell." His voice broke. "His name is Ray. Please don't let Ray." "Ray is going to be fine," Grace said. She didn't know that. She had no idea whether Ray was going to be fine, but she said it with such absolute conviction that she felt Darnell's whole body relax by half an inch. And sometimes that half inch is what keeps a man from giving up entirely. "I need you to keep talking to him. Keep his name in his ears. Can you do that for me, Darnell?" "Yes, ma'am." Grace stood, turned back to her car, and pulled out her phone. No signal. She stared at the screen for a moment. 0 bars. The blizzard had taken out the nearest cell relay, which was something that happened on Route 46 with painful regularity and which the county had been promising to fix for 11 years. Grace noted this fact, accepted it, and put her phone back in her pocket with the practiced calm of a woman who had raised 2 children largely alone while Peter worked long haul, who had learned that panic is a luxury and most situations don't have the patience for it. She walked back to Darnell. "I can't reach anyone by phone," she said. "My house is 4 miles that way. I'm going to take as many of you as I can fit in my car, and I'm going to come back. How many of the others are badly hurt?" Darnell looked at her for a long moment. She could see him processing her, this small, gray-haired woman in a green coat and snow boots, in the middle of a Montana whiteout, telling him she was going to save 19 bikers with a 2004 Chevy Malibu. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the desperate arithmetic of a man with no other options. 4 critical, he said, maybe 5. The rest are upright, but some of them aren't. They're not making sense anymore. Cold, you know. Grace knew. Hypothermia, the confusion that sets in when core temperature drops, when the body starts shutting down the expensive operations, the talking, the thinking, in favor of the essential ones. She had read about it. She had never been grateful for that reading until now. "I'm going to need you to help me walk the ones who can walk to my car," she said, "and I'm going to need you to stay with Ray. Can you do both?" "I can do both," Darnell said, and there was something in his voice that had shifted. Something had moved from fear to purpose, the way water changes when it goes from still to running. "Tell me what to do." What happened in the next 40 minutes was the kind of thing that Grace would later struggle to describe, because her brain, even as it was happening, seemed to be watching from a slight distance, the way it does during extreme events, cataloging details with strange precision, while the emotional weight of it waited patiently behind a door that would open later. She remembered the crunch of snow. She remembered the sound of her car door opening and closing, opening and closing. She remembered the smell of cold leather and machine oil and fear. She remembered the weight of a man's arm across her shoulders as she walked a barely conscious biker named Stick toward her back seat. And she remembered how he kept saying, "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm so sorry." And she remembered telling him to hush. There was nothing to be sorry for. She made 3 trips, 3 full round trips, 4 miles each way, in a blizzard, in a car with a heating system that was held together by optimism and old rubber seals. Between runs, she got back to her house long enough to unlock the door and point the bikers who could walk on their own toward the living room, the kitchen, the couch, every flat surface, every source of warmth. Her furnace was old, but it was strong, and she turned it up as far as it would go and started the gas fireplace in the living room and turned on the oven and left the oven door open, the way her mother had done during cold snaps when Grace was a child. Then she got back in the car. The second trip was the hardest. On the return drive, visibility had dropped to nearly nothing. Grace was navigating almost entirely by the white-on-white texture of the road edge, the subtle difference between the snow on the asphalt and the snow on the shoulder. Her knuckles on the wheel were white. Her jaw was clenched so tight she would feel it in her back teeth for 3 days afterward. She passed the spot where she had first stopped, and for a moment, just a moment, she thought she had gone too far, overshot somehow, and panic spiked hard in her chest before her headlights found Darnell, still at the guardrail, still with Ray's head in his lap, talking low and steady into the man's ear. "Still here," Darnell said when she reached him, and she couldn't tell if he was talking to her or to Ray, and she decided it didn't matter. They got Ray into the back seat lying down, Darnell wedged beside him, one hand still on the man's chest, as if monitoring his heartbeat by feel. Grace drove home without speaking. There was nothing to say. The only sound was the engine and the wind, and Darnell murmuring to Ray, the same few words over and over, a kind of prayer or a command or both. "Stay with me, brother. Stay with me." When they got back to the house, Grace saw something she had not expected. The bikers who had arrived before, the ones who could move, who had been herded inside, had not simply sat down and waited. They had organized. One of them had found her kitchen, located her largest pots, and had water heating on 3 of the 4 burners. Another had her first aid kit open on the coffee table, sorted by type with a quick efficiency that told her he had done this before. A woman, Grace had not registered until now that one of the group was a woman, was crouched over a man laid out on the couch, 2 fingers pressed to his wrist, her eyes closed in concentration. Grace stopped just inside the door and stared. "Is this everyone?" the woman asked without looking up. Sharp voice. "Competent, used to being listened to." "3 more coming," Grace said. "I have 1 more run." The woman opened her eyes and looked at Grace directly for the first time. She was in her 40s, dark hair plastered to her face, a cut across her cheekbone beginning to crust over. Her eyes were calm in the specific way that eyes get when the person behind them has trained for years to stay calm in bad situations. "You've been going back out in that?" she said. "They're still on the road," Grace said. Something moved across the woman's face, something that might have been, that was, Grace was certain of it, the beginning of tears. But the woman blinked it back with the same precision she was applying to everything else. "How many more?" 3. 2 of them can walk with help. One is, Grace glanced toward Darnell, who was maneuvering Ray through the doorway with help from 2 others. "One needs a stretcher, and I don't have a stretcher." "We'll rig one," the woman said immediately, already standing, already looking around Grace's living room with the calculating eyes of someone about to improvise medical equipment from a grandmother's couch cushions and curtain rods. "Give me 2 minutes. You should not be going back out there alone." "I've been driving that road for 40 years, Grace said. "That's not what I said." The woman met her eyes. "I said you shouldn't go alone. Let me get Marcus. He's the biggest one who's still functional, and you're going to need the help carrying the last man in." Grace looked at her for a moment. "What's your name?" "Dr. Vega," the woman said, then almost as an afterthought, as if it had been a long time since anyone had asked her first name in a moment like this. "Elena." "Elena," Grace said, "I'm going to need to leave in 3 minutes." "I'll have Marcus at your car in 2, Elena said, and turned away, already calling across the room. Grace went to her kitchen, poured a cup of coffee she had no memory of making, drank half of it standing at the counter, and stared out the window at the white nothing of the blizzard. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from cold now, but from the particular tremor that comes when adrenaline and exhaustion collide. She wrapped both hands around the mug and breathed. "Pete," she said quietly, "you're not going to believe this." From the living room, someone coughed. Someone else said something low and urgent. She could hear Elena's voice, even and commanding, moving between people like a current. She could hear the water boiling on the stove. She put down the mug, straightened her coat, and went back out to her car. The third trip was short by distance and long by everything else. Marcus, who turned out to be a man of about 50, with a graying beard and the quiet deliberateness of someone who had been in hard situations before and survived them by thinking twice before every move, said almost nothing on the drive back to the site. He sat in the passenger seat with his arms crossed and his jaw set and his eyes forward. And once, when the car slid on a patch of ice and Grace corrected smoothly and without drama, he glanced at her sidelong. "You're good," he said. It was a simple statement, no drama in it. "I'm from here," she said, which was both answer and explanation. They got the last 3 out. The man they carried back was a younger one, could not have been older than 25, Grace thought, and then revised that upwards slightly because the cold and the ice had aged him in ways that made it hard to tell. His name turned out to be Tommy. She wouldn't find out his last name until much later. What she noticed in the backlight of her headlamps was that his left hand, curled loosely against his chest, was still holding something. A folded piece of paper or a photograph, she couldn't quite tell, gripped with the stubborn, unconscious reflex of a body that has decided this particular thing is important enough to hold on to, even when everything else is shutting down. She noticed it. She tucked it away in the back of her mind the way you tuck away things you don't have time for yet. They drove back through the blizzard. By the time Grace pulled into her driveway for the last time, her house was full. 19 people in a home built for 2, in a blizzard on a Montana night that was now deep into the small hours of the morning. Her living room floor had become a triage ward. Her kitchen table was a supply station. Elena was moving between bodies laid on blankets with the contained urgency of someone running out of time but refusing to let that show. The man from the stove, Grace had caught his name as Ricky, had organized the others who were well enough to stand into a kind of rotating duty. Someone always watching the critical ones, someone always keeping the water hot, someone always checking the door for any shift in the storm. Grace stood in the middle of it all, and for a moment she couldn't move. Not from exhaustion, though she was exhausted. Not from fear, though the night had been full of it. She stood there because the feeling that came over her was one she hadn't felt in 3 years. The feeling of a full house. The particular pressure and warmth and noise of more than one person needing something, more than one voice, more than one heartbeat filling the rooms that had been so terribly quiet for so terribly long. It undid her, just for a second. Then Darnell was beside her. She hadn't heard him move, and he put a hand on her shoulder, gentle for such a large man, and said, "You need to sit down, ma'am. Just for a minute. We got it from here." "I don't need to," she started. "Ma'am," his voice was steady, kind, immovable. "Sit down, please." She sat down. She sat in Peter's old armchair, the one she never sat in because it was his, because it still held the shape of him somehow, because sitting in it felt like an invasion of something sacred. And she sat there and she let herself breathe for the first time since she had gotten out of her car on Route 46 and walked into the dark. From where she sat, she could see almost the whole room. She could see Elena crouched over the young man, Tommy, doing something efficient and quick with bandages. She could see Marcus in the corner, helping an older biker with a probable broken wrist, working with a certainty of touch that spoke of medical training, even if she didn't know it yet. She could see Darnell, back beside Ray, still talking to him, still keeping that thread of connection alive between the man's consciousness and the world. And she could see Tommy's hand, still holding that paper, even as Elena worked over him, even as his body came slowly, reluctantly, painfully back toward warmth. Whatever was in that hand, he was not letting go. Grace Turner watched the house breathe around her, watched 19 strangers become, in the space of a few hours in a Montana blizzard, something she didn't have a word for yet. Not family, not exactly. Something older than that. Something more like the way people used to survive. Together, by necessity, by the stubbornness of the living. She closed her eyes. She meant to rest for 1 minute. She did not know yet what the morning would bring. She did not know what Tommy was holding. She did not know that by sunrise, her living room would contain a revelation that would reach back 30 years through her own memory and crack her open like a spring thaw. Slow, irresistible, flooding everything she thought she knew about the life she had lived and the good she had done in it. She didn't know any of that yet. She only knew the house was full and the furnace was running and 19 people were breathing. For now, that was everything. She didn't sleep long, maybe 40 minutes, maybe less. What pulled her back wasn't a sound exactly. It was the absence of one. The house had gone quiet in a particular way, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. That means something has changed, and the people in the room all know it, and no one wants to be the one to say it first. Grace opened her eyes. Elena was standing in the middle of the living room with her arms at her sides and her eyes closed. And Grace recognized that posture. She had stood that way herself the night Peter died, in the hospital hallway, just before the doctor came out. It was the posture of someone gathering themselves for the next thing, storing up what's left. Elena, Grace was out of the chair before she was fully awake. What happened? Elena opened her eyes. Ray's breathing stabilized, she said immediately, and Grace felt the fear unclench. That's good news. That's the good news. What's the other news? Elena looked at her for a moment. Then she said, Tommy's running a fever. It came on fast, too fast. He must have been in the cold longer than the others before they found him. She paused. I need to know what medications you have in this house. Everything. Doesn't matter if it seems unrelated. I need to know. Grace was already moving to the bathroom cabinet. She called out as she went, listing everything she found. Blood pressure medication, aspirin, some leftover antibiotics from a dental procedure 2 years ago, a bottle of children's ibuprofen she had bought for when her grandchildren visited and had never finished, vitamin C tablets, a topical antibiotic cream. She heard herself reciting this inventory and was aware, somewhere in the back of her mind, of how thin it sounded, how insufficient. Elena appeared in the bathroom doorway and took the antibiotics from her hand, checked the label, did the calculation behind her eyes. These are amoxicillin, not ideal but workable if we're looking at early-stage infection. She looked at Grace. Do you have any alcohol? Not rubbing alcohol, drinking alcohol. Bourbon, Grace said. Peter kept a bottle in the cabinet above the refrigerator. I haven't touched it. Something flickered in Elena's expression. Not quite pity, not quite respect, something between them. She didn't comment on the bourbon untouched for 3 years. She just said, I need it, and I need your clean towels. All of them. Grace gave her both without hesitation. Back in the living room, Marcus was awake and upright, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. And when Grace came in, she saw that he had taken stock of her pantry at some point during the night. The canned goods were organized on the counter by heat time. The largest pot was back on the stove, and he had found the bag of rice she kept in the back of the cabinet and had it measured out in a bowl. "You were going to cook?" Grace said. "People need to eat," Marcus said simply. He had a way of saying practical things that made them sound profound. "You mind?" "I mind you asking instead of just doing it," Grace said. "Go ahead." For the first time, Marcus smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that doesn't advertise itself, and it changed his face completely. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Grace poured herself coffee and leaned against the counter, and for a few minutes, she just let herself exist in the strange domesticity of the moment. A man she had never met cooking in her kitchen at 5 in the morning, while a blizzard pressed against the windows and 18 other strangers filled her house with the sound of difficult breathing and low voices and the specific smell of cold leather slowly warming up. "You're a nurse?" she asked Marcus. It wasn't really a question. "Paramedic," he said, 22 years. "And Elena?" "ER physician, 12 years. He stirred the rice without looking up. "Ricky over there is a nurse practitioner. The man by the fireplace, the one who hasn't spoken, he's a cardiologist. Name's Dr. Bernard Park. He took a bad hit in the fall, and he's more shaken than he's letting on. But there is nothing wrong with his mind." Marcus paused. "You saved a lot of the right people tonight, Mrs. Turner." Grace was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know who you were," she said. "I wouldn't have stopped differently if you'd been anybody else." "I know," Marcus said. "That's what I mean." She was about to respond when she heard it, a sound from the living room that stopped her cold. Not a cry, not a shout. A name. Her name, spoken in a voice she didn't recognize, rough and confused and searching. "Grace? Is there a Grace here?" She set down her coffee and walked into the living room. Tommy was awake. He was propped up slightly, one of her couch cushions behind his back, and Elena was beside him immediately, one hand on his forehead, saying something quick and low. But his eyes, dark, fever-bright, moving around the room with the desperate scanning motion of someone who doesn't know where they are, had found Grace in the doorway and locked on her with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. "Hey," Grace said, moving toward him. "Hey, take it easy. You're safe. You're in my house." "Your name," Tommy said. His voice was rough, barely there. "What's your name?" "Grace Turner." Something happened to his face. The fever confusion didn't clear, not entirely, but beneath it something else moved, something that was recognition and disbelief knotted together so tightly she couldn't separate them. "Grace Turner," he repeated, like he was testing it, like he had said those two words before, somewhere else, a long time ago, and was measuring the memory against the reality. "That's right," she said. She crouched down to his level, the way she used to crouch for small children who needed to look you in the eye. "Do you know me?" "Your hand," he said. "Can I need to check." He reached out and she gave him her hand without thinking about it, because he was sick and young and confused, and it seemed like the most natural thing in the world. And he turned her hand palm up and looked at it, and then let out a breath that sounded like something being released after a very long time of holding. "The scar," he said, "right here." His thumb moved across the base of her palm. "You got it on the edge of a lunch tray. I watched it happen. You never even made a sound. You just wrapped it in your apron and kept serving." Grace's whole body went still. She looked at her hand, at the thin, pale line she had carried for, how long? 30 years? More? A lunch tray at Jefferson Elementary, her second year working the cafeteria, before she had moved up to running the whole kitchen. She had nicked it on a cracked tray edge and wrapped it and kept going because there were 200 kids waiting for lunch, and they couldn't wait. She had not thought about that scar in decades. "How do you—" she started. "Table 7, Tommy said. By the window. I sat there every day because it was closest to the door, and I could get out fast because sometimes I needed to get out fast." A pause. His eyes were still locked on hers, still fever bright but also, desperately, lucid. I wore the same jacket for 6 weeks because it was the only one I had. You noticed. You didn't say anything about it. You never made me feel like. You never made a face. You just put extra on my tray every day and you smiled at me like I was just a kid. Not the kid. Not the kid that everyone knew was going home to nothing. Grace could not speak. Jefferson Elementary, she said finally. Her voice came out just above a whisper. You were at Jefferson. Tommy Reeves, he said. I was 7. You used to put extra cornbread on my tray. His jaw was trembling, and she could not tell anymore how much of it was fever and how much was something else entirely. I've been looking for you for 6 years. I found out your name from an old school record, and I had a photograph. I had a photograph of the staff from that year. Someone's mother had taken it at the Christmas party, and I've been carrying it. He looked at his hand, his empty hand. The photograph. Grace remembered it. The thing he had been gripping in the backseat of her car, in the cold, his body deciding without his permission that this was worth holding on to. Where is it? He said, and the fear in his voice was sudden and sharp. Where's my... It's here. Elena reached into the front pocket of her vest and held out a folded photograph, slightly damaged at the edges from the cold and damp, but whole. She had clearly found it when she was treating him, had tucked it somewhere safe without knowing what it was. She held it out to Tommy, but he looked at Grace. You open it, he said. Grace's hands were not steady when she took it. She unfolded it carefully. It was a photograph of a group of women standing in a school kitchen, dressed in aprons. Someone had written, Jefferson Elementary Staff Christmas, 1994, along the bottom edge in blue pen. Grace found herself in the back row, 3rd from the left. Younger, dark-haired, laughing at something out of frame, completely unaware of being preserved, completely unaware of what that moment would become. She had been 38 years old in that photograph. She stared at herself across 30 years. That's you, Tommy said. It wasn't a question. That's me, she said. The room had gone entirely silent. She hadn't noticed when, at some point, the low murmur of voices had stopped, and the other bikers who were awake and ambulatory had turned toward the kitchen doorway, toward whatever they were hearing in the silence between Grace and Tommy, drawn by the particular gravity of a moment that announces itself without words. Darnell was at the edge of the room, Ray's breathing steady beside him, watching with his arms crossed and an expression on his face that Grace couldn't quite name. Not surprise, not exactly. Something more like confirmation of a thing he had already half believed was possible. I became a PA because of you, Tommy said. Physician assistant. I work a free clinic in Billings 3 days a week. He stopped. The effort of talking was costing him. I kept thinking, if I ever found you, I would tell you that. That you, that a lunch tray, that extra cornbread doesn't sound like anything, but it was everything. It was the one place every day where somebody treated me like I was worth something. He pressed his eyes closed. You were the only adult in my life who looked at me like that. Grace was crying. She had not realized she was crying until the tears reached her jaw. She reached out and put her hand on the side of Tommy's face, the way she might have with her own son, with her own grandchildren, with any child who needed a hand and a face to look at that said, you are here, and you are real, and you matter. I remember you, she said, and the extraordinary thing, the thing that broke something open in her chest, was that she did. Not the name, not the face as it was now, but the boy, the jacket, the way he had always thanked her, always quietly, never meeting her eyes fully, as if kindness was something he was learning to trust, but hadn't quite yet. She remembered thinking he was the kind of child who needed someone to stand steady in his line of sight for long enough that he could learn what steady looked like. She had not known she was teaching him anything. She had not known he was watching. I remember you, she said again, because it was the truest thing she had ever said in her life. Tommy made a sound that was not quite a word, something between relief and grief, the sound of a wound finally reaching air, and Grace kept her hand on his face and let him make it. Behind her, she heard Marcus set down his spoon very carefully against the edge of the pot. She heard Ricky clear his throat. She heard Darnell say something very quiet to Ray, just 3 words, too low to catch. She heard Elena breathe out slowly, controlled, the way a person breathes when they are refusing to cry in a professional context, and it is costing them more than they expected. The storm pressed against the windows. The furnace ran. The house held. Grace Turner knelt on her own living room floor in the small hours of a February morning, her hand on the face of a boy she had fed cornbread to 30 years ago, now a man who had crossed a Montana blizzard, coincidentally, impossibly, completely, into her care for the second time in his life, and she felt something she had not felt since Peter died. The sense that the shape of her life made sense, that the pieces of it, the small ones she had never thought to count, the extra servings and the scar on her palm, and the 40 years of driving Route 46 in all weather because you don't leave people on the road, that all of it had been moving towards something even when she couldn't see it. She didn't know yet what the morning would demand of all of them. She didn't know what would be asked, what would be given, what 19 people and 1 woman could build together out of what had nearly been a tragedy on a frozen road. She only knew that Tommy's fever would need to break before it got worse, and that Elena's jaw was set in a way that said she intended to make sure it did, and that Marcus's rice was almost ready, and that Ray was breathing, and that Darnell had not left his side once in the entire night. She only knew what she had always known, which was that you keep going, you keep your hands warm, and you don't leave people on the road. Whatever came next, that would be enough to start with. Grace knew the exact time because she was watching the clock on the microwave when Elena pressed the back of her hand to Tommy's forehead and exhaled. Not a sigh of relief exactly, more like the controlled release of a breath held for hours, the kind that a person with Elena's training allows themselves only after the immediate danger has passed and not a second before. "Down," Elena said to no one in particular. "It's coming down." Across the room, Marcus nodded once without looking up from the stove. Grace sat back in Peter's chair and allowed herself 5 full seconds of pure, uncomplicated gratitude. Then she stood up, because there was still work to do, and the morning had arrived, whether any of them were ready for it or not. The storm had shifted sometime in the last hour. The wind had dropped from a scream to a low, continuous moan, and the particular quality of the silence between gusts had changed. There was less fury in it, more exhaustion, the way a tantrum winds down not because the feeling is gone, but because the body can't sustain it. Grace had lived in Montana long enough to read weather the way other people read faces. This blizzard was not done, but it had spent its worst. 19 people were alive in her house who might not have been. She thought about that while she put more water on to boil. She thought about it carefully, the way you press a bruise to understand its full extent, because she knew herself well enough to know that later, in a day or a week or a month, when the adrenaline was fully gone and she was alone again in this house that had just been so briefly, violently, beautifully full, the weight of it would arrive, and she wanted to have already looked at it before it found her in an unguarded moment. 19 people, 3 trips, a 2004 Chevy Malibu, and a heater that sounded like an old man climbing stairs. She almost laughed. She pressed her lips together instead and poured the coffee. It was Darnell who interrupted her thoughts, appearing in the kitchen doorway with the particular quietness of large men who have learned to move carefully through small spaces. He had a look on his face she hadn't seen on him yet, not the controlled terror of the guardrail, not the focused urgency of the night. This was something softer, something that was working up to something. "Mrs. Turner," he said. "Grace," she said. She had told him this twice already. She said it without irritation, just as a fact. "Grace." He stopped, tried again. We need to talk, all of us. When you're ready, the ones who can sit up." He paused. "There are some things you should know about us." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "I already know you're medical professionals," she said. "Elena told me last night, or this morning. I've lost track." Something moved across Darnell's face. Not surprise, more like recalibration. "She told you that." "She needed me to understand what resources we had in the room," Grace said. "She was right to tell me." "There's more than that," Darnell said. "That's what I mean. There's more." Grace set down her cup. "Give me 10 minutes," she said. "Let me make sure everyone's been fed something." She made oatmeal. It was the most she could do with what she had. Oatmeal and the last of her brown sugar and some canned peaches she'd been saving for no reason she could identify anymore. And she made a pot large enough for everyone, and she didn't think about the grocery bill because some things you don't think about until later, and this was one of them. She moved through her kitchen with the muscle memory of a woman who had fed large numbers of people for decades, who knew how to make limited resources stretch, who had learned in a school cafeteria that the way you give food to people matters as much as the food itself, that you look them in the eye, that you don't make them feel the weight of needing it. She served the ones who couldn't move first. Ray, who was awake now, conscious, still weak, but his eyes tracking and his voice working, took the bowl with both hands and said, "Thank you, ma'am." And his voice cracked on the last word, and he looked away quickly. "Don't you dare apologize for that," Grace told him. Ray made a sound that might have been a laugh. By the time she had moved through the room, the ones who could sit up had gathered at the kitchen table and on chairs pulled from every corner of the house. 11 people arranged in a rough circle, all still in their riding clothes, all still carrying the night on them in ways that a few hours of warmth hadn't fully resolved. Elena sat at Grace's right. Darnell took the chair directly across. Marcus was at the stove, back slightly turned but clearly listening. Tommy was propped against the wall on a folded blanket, a bowl in his hands, close enough to be part of the circle without being asked to move more than he should. Darnell cleared his throat. "We're not a motorcycle club," he said. Grace waited. "I mean, we ride together. Some of us have for 20 years. But the Hells Angels thing it's more complicated than that." He looked around the table, got small nods from several faces. "We ride in the colors because the original chapter gave us their blessing. They know what we do. Some of them do it with us on different routes." He pressed his hands flat on the table. "We run medical supply routes, rural areas, reservation communities, towns that haven't had a functioning clinic in 10, 15 years. We load up the bikes with whatever we can carry: medication, wound care supplies, portable diagnostic equipment, and we ride the routes that the supply trucks won't take in bad weather or bad roads, or because the contracts don't make it worth their while." Grace heard the words. She processed them. She said nothing yet because she wanted to hear all of it before she let herself react. "This route," Darnell continued, "was supposed to be a delivery run. 3 communities north of here, one of them a res community that's been waiting 3 weeks for insulin because the last shipment didn't make it through. We had the supplies on the bikes." He stopped. "Some of the bags didn't survive the fall. Some of them did. We don't know yet which." And there it was, the thing under the thing. Grace thought about the people north of here, the ones waiting for insulin, the ones for whom 3 weeks was already too long, for whom another week could mean a hospitalization or worse. She thought about this the way she thought about most things, directly, without flinching, because she had found that flinching just delays the moment when you have to look straight at something. "How much survived?" she asked. Darnell looked at Marcus. Marcus turned from the stove. "I did a check about an hour ago," Marcus said. 3 bags are confirmed intact. 1 is partially intact. The rest?" He shook his head once. Short, final. "How much was in the lost bags?" "Enough to matter," Elena said quietly. 2 weeks of insulin for approximately 40 patients. wound care supplies for a clinic that's been doing procedures with compromised materials, blood pressure medication for a community with a cardiac event rate that would make your cardiologist cry. She paused. Dr. Park has been trying not to think about that all night. The numbers are his specialty. From the corner, Dr. Bernard Park, who had indeed not spoken for most of the night, a compact man in his late 50s with precise hands and the kind of stillness that concentrates itself rather than dispersing, looked up. His voice, when he finally used it, was careful and even. 43 patients currently managing type 2 diabetes on that route alone, he said. 17 of them are already on reduced rations because their families have been stretching supplies. He said it like a doctor presenting a chart, but his eyes said something else entirely. We needed to get through last night. The table was quiet. Grace sat with this. She sat with the full dimensions of it. Not just the 19 people in her house, but the 43 at the end of the route, and the 17 stretching what they had, and the clinic with the compromised materials, and all the invisible arithmetic of rural healthcare that most people never saw because it happened in the places between places. In the gaps of the map where the supply lines ran thin, and the roads got hard, and the trucks made their calculations and turned around. She had lived in one of those gaps for 30 years. She had just never seen the inside of the equation before. "What do you need?" she said. Darnell blinked. "What? What do you need right now? Today. Not eventually, today. The roads will be passable by midday if this storm keeps backing off. What do you need to do to complete the run?" The table exchanged glances. Something was happening in the room that Grace could feel, but couldn't fully name yet. A kind of recalibration. The same thing that had happened in Darnell's face out on the road when he had assessed her and concluded she was real. Elena said slowly, "We need to assess what's salvageable from the bike bags. Some of them are still on the road. We'd need someone to... My neighbor Carl Briggs has a snowplow truck, and he owes me 11 years of favors," Grace said. "I can have him on the road in an hour. What else?" "Replacement supplies for what we lost," Marcus said, "which realistically means the county medical storage facility," Dr. Park said, "in Dillon. If someone with authority makes a formal request for emergency dispersal, the county can release emergency stock under the rural access provision. It takes a signed form and a physician's authorization." He looked at Elena. "I have my credentials," Elena said. She was already reaching for her vest. "They survived the crash." She pulled out a waterproof document sleeve, the kind of forethought that spoke of someone who had been in the field long enough to know what you protect first. "I can make the call. I just need a landline because my phone is dead." Grace stood up, went to the kitchen wall, and pointed at the mounted phone that every person under 50 who had been in her house had looked at with various degrees of archaeological curiosity. 32 years on that wall, she said. Never once let me down." Elena stared at it for a half second, then picked it up, listened for a dial tone, and something crossed her face that was very close to reverence. She started dialing. The next hour moved the way hours do when everyone in the room has a job and knows how to do it. Grace called Carl Briggs, who answered on the second ring, said nothing for 3 full seconds when she explained the situation, then said, "Give me 45 minutes," and hung up. Dr. Park had someone bring him paper and a pen and began reconstructing his patient supply list from memory with the systematic precision of a man who had been dreading exactly this kind of reckoning and had therefore memorized everything necessary to address it. Ricky, the nurse practitioner, went through the salvaged supply bags one by one and called out contents while Tommy, fever down, hands steadier, wrote everything in a notebook Grace found in her kitchen junk drawer. Darnell sat beside Ray and talked to him in a low, continuous voice, the way he had all night, except now the tone had changed. Less prayer, more conversation. Ray was awake enough to respond, and Grace caught fragments as she moved through the room. "Yes, brother, I know, I'm not going anywhere." and she understood that she was witnessing something private and did not linger. It was Marcus who stopped her in the hallway with a particular quiet gravity that she had come to understand was his way of signaling that something important was about to happen. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about Tommy." "He already told me," Grace said. "The cafeteria, Jefferson Elementary." "Not that," Marcus said. He looked at her steadily. "Tommy has been riding this route for 4 years. He's the one who mapped it. He grew up in this part of Montana, and he knew exactly which communities had been left behind and exactly how bad the gap was. He's the one who went to the chapter and made the case for the medical run. He's the one who wrote the proposal and tracked down the first supply donations and drove the pilot route alone, before anyone else committed, before there was any structure around it." Marcus paused. "He built this from nothing, because of what happened to him when he was a kid, because he knew what it felt like to be in a place that the system had decided wasn't worth the trip." Grace stood very still. "He never found you," Marcus said. "He spent 6 years trying, and he never found you. The school records were incomplete. You'd moved twice, and eventually, I think he decided he had to stop looking because it was costing him something he couldn't afford to keep spending." Another pause. "He had the photograph, but he told me once he wasn't even sure you were still alive. He said he kept the photo because he needed to remember that the thing that changed him had been real. That a person like that actually existed." Marcus looked at her with the directness of a man who spent his working life in situations where there was no time to be indirect. "And then last night you drove out of a blizzard and put him in your back seat." Grace found that she needed to put one hand on the hallway wall, not from weakness, from the sheer, almost unbearable fullness of what was being handed to her, the understanding that her life, the parts of it she had considered small and unremarkable, the extra cornbread and the patient smile, and the 30 years of showing up for other people's children before showing up for herself, had moved through the world in ways she would never have found if a blizzard hadn't thrown 19 people across her road on a February night. "Does he know you're telling me this?" she managed. "No," Marcus said, "but I think he'd be glad." From the kitchen, Elena called out that she had the county facility on the line and needed Dr. Park. There was the sound of chairs, movement, voices converging. The house that had been so quiet for 3 years was loud again, purposeful, full of the specific noise of people who had decided that things could be better and were acting accordingly. Grace straightened. She took her hand off the wall. She thought of Tommy's face when he had said, "I've been looking for you for 6 years." She thought of Peter's chair, and the photograph, and the scar on her palm that she had not thought of in decades until a man in a fever pressed his thumb against it and told her it was the detail he had held on to, the proof that the woman who had fed him was real and human and imperfect and present. She thought about the 43 people waiting for insulin at the end of a snow-covered road that her neighbor Carl Briggs was already warming up his plow truck to help clear. Then she walked back into her kitchen, picked up a pen and said, "Tell me what else needs to be signed." Carl Briggs arrived in 43 minutes. Grace heard the plow truck before she saw it, the deep diesel rumble cutting through the post-storm quiet like something dependable and permanent, the sound of a man who had said 45 minutes and meant it. She was at the door before he knocked. Carl was 71 years old, built like a fence post that had survived several bad winters, and he had the face of a man who had heard a great many unusual requests in his life and had developed the wisdom to stop being surprised by them. He looked past Grace into the living room, took in the scene, 19 people in various states of recovery, leather vests, medical equipment improvised from kitchen supplies, and said simply, "You want to tell me on the road or after?" "After," Grace said. "How's Route 46? "Passable from the junction. Gets worse the last 2 miles toward where you said they went down." "Can you get there?" Carl looked at her with the patient exasperation of a man who had been operating heavy equipment in Montana winters, since before Grace had moved to the county. "Grace," he said. "Then let's go," she said, and reached for her coat. Darnell was already standing. "I'm coming," he said. It was not a request. Marcus was right behind him. "Me too. I know where the bikes went down, and I know which bags we need to prioritize." Elena looked up from the kitchen table where she had been on the phone for the last 20 minutes, working through the county emergency dispersal process with the focused persistence of a woman who had spent her career negotiating with systems designed to say no. She put her hand over the receiver. "Grace, the county administrator is being difficult. He wants a secondary authorization from the regional medical office, and the regional office isn't answering." "Who's the administrator?" Grace asked. "A man named Kettler, Doug Kettler." Grace stopped pulling on her glove. "Douglas Kettler, big man, wears a bolo tie even in winter?" Elena blinked. "I have no idea what he's wearing." "Put him on," Grace said. Elena hesitated for exactly 1 second, then held out the phone. Grace took it. "Doug," she said, "it's Grace Turner, Peter's wife. You came to his funeral, and you ate all of my deviled eggs. And you told me that if I ever needed anything, I should call you." She paused. "I'm calling you." The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds. "Grace," Douglas Kettler said, "how many patients are we talking about?" 43 confirmed diabetic, 17 on reduced rations, 1 clinic running on compromised wound care supplies, and a group of medical professionals who drove into a blizzard to deliver the supplies who are currently sitting in my living room with broken bones and frostbite. Another pause. "Doug, these people nearly died to make this delivery. The least this county can do is release the emergency stock." Another silence, shorter this time. "I'll have the release authorized within the hour," Kettler said. "Tell your people to bring a vehicle to the Dillon facility. I'll call ahead." Grace handed the phone back to Elena, who was staring at her with an expression that walked the line between admiration and disbelief. "How did you—" "Doug Kettler has been trying to do right by this county for 20 years, Grace said, pulling her second glove on. "He just needs someone to remind him what right looks like sometimes." She turned toward the door. "Keep working the phones. Dr. Park, that list of patients. Is it complete?" "Complete as I can make it from memory," Park said. "Make it more complete. I want names. I want addresses. I want every community on that route. When I get back, we're going to talk about what comes after today." She looked at him steadily. "Because today is not the end of this." Park looked at her for a moment with those precise, careful eyes. Then he picked up his pen. Carl's truck made it to the crash site in under 20 minutes. The bikes were where they had been left. Some had slid further down the shoulder in the continuing wind, and the snow had covered the smaller debris, but the supply bags were findable, and Marcus moved through the site with the organized efficiency of a man conducting a search, calling out to Darnell, digging through drifts with his bare hands when the gloves got in the way. Grace stayed near the truck, not because she couldn't help, but because Carl was looking at the scene with something in his face she wanted to address. "Medical run," she said. "They've been doing it for years." Carl was quiet for a moment. "Why don't I know about this?" "Because nobody told you," Grace said. "Because these things happen in the gaps, and the people in the gaps are used to not being seen." She paused. "That's going to change." Carl looked at her. "You've got that voice on," he said. "What voice?" "The voice you get when you've decided something." He turned back to the site. "Peter used to say that when Grace gets that voice, the only sensible thing to do is get out of the way or get to work." Grace felt the familiar pull of grief, not the sharp kind anymore, more like a tide, regular and expected and somehow comforting in its predictability. "He was right," she said. Marcus shouted from further down the shoulder. 3 more bags intact, 1 partial. And I found the portable diagnostic kit. Case is cracked, but the equipment looks okay." Darnell held up a larger bag. "Insulin's in here, packed in cold foam." He paused, checking something. Still within temperature range. The cold actually kept it. The Montana blizzard that had nearly killed 19 people had also, in one of those lateral pieces of luck that life occasionally offers, kept the temperature exactly cold enough to preserve the medication that those people had been carrying. Grace noted this without commenting on it. Some things you just receive. They loaded everything into Carl's truck and drove back. By the time they returned, the house had transformed again in the particular way it had been doing all morning, each hour reorganizing itself around whatever the current need was. Dr. Park had his patient list rebuilt and annotated across 4 pages of Grace's notepad paper. Ricky had inventoried every salvage supply against the list and produced a gap analysis with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had clearly done this before, under worse conditions. Tommy was sitting up fully now, color returning, the fever's residue still on him but no longer in command. He looked at Grace when she came through the door, and something moved between them. A look that had no specific content but carried enormous weight. The look of 2 people who have acknowledged something true about each other and are still adjusting to the size of it. "Insulin is intact," Grace told the room. The reaction was immediate. Ricky said something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. Park closed his eyes briefly. Marcus nodded with the deep satisfaction of a man who has been holding his breath for hours. "We can make the run," Darnell said. He was looking at the group with an expression that was working through logistics and emotion simultaneously. "The 2 bikes that are still rideable, Caesar's and mine. Between them we can carry the critical supplies. The rest can go in Carl's truck if he's in," Carl said from the doorway. He had followed Grace in without being asked, which told her he had already decided on the road. "The roads are passable from the junction," Marcus said. "If we leave within the hour, we can make all 3 stops before dark." "You're not going anywhere," Elena said flatly. She was looking at Marcus with the expression of a physician who has stopped asking nicely. "You have a hairline fracture in your left wrist and 2 cracked ribs. You are not riding a motorcycle today." Marcus opened his mouth. "Marcus," her voice did not change in volume or tone, but it changed in weight. "I need you to be functional next week. Sit down." Marcus sat down. "I'll go," Tommy said. Every head in the room turned. "Tommy," Elena started. "My fever broke 4 hours ago. I can ride." He met Elena's eyes directly. "I know this route better than anyone in this room. I mapped it. I know which families are most critical. I know the roads. I know the community contacts." He paused. "And I have a reason to finish this particular run." He was looking at Grace when he said the last part. Elena pressed her lips together. She walked to Tommy, put 2 fingers on his wrist, watched her own watch for 10 seconds, released, checked his pupils, put her hand on his forehead. "If your temperature goes above 100, you stop, and you call me," she said. "If you feel the confusion coming back, you stop. If—" "Elena," Tommy said very gently, "I'll stop." She stepped back, said nothing, which was her version of yes. Darnell looked at Grace. There was something in his expression that had been building since the kitchen table conversation that morning, since the moment she had taken Doug Kettler's call and solved in 2 minutes a problem that had been stalling them for 40, and it finally surfaced in full. "Grace," he said, "before we go, we need to talk about you." She looked at him steadily. "I don't need anything, Darnell." "That's not what I said," he replied, and his voice had the same immovable gentleness it had on the road when he had told her to sit down. "We want to do something, not because we owe you, there's no accounting for what happened last night, but because we can, and because—" He stopped, started again. "You're living in a house where the insulation is so shot I could feel it from the couch. Your car has a heater that could quit on you any morning. You've got medical bills in that stack on your counter. I wasn't snooping, Grace, they're just visible. And you're out here alone on Route 46 in a Montana winter without anyone checking on you." Grace said nothing. The chapter has a foundation, Darnell continued. We set it up 2 years ago for exactly this kind of situation. Community members who fall through the gaps the same way the communities on our route do. We want to put it to work. He looked at her. Not charity, investment. There's a difference. There is, Grace said carefully, and I appreciate the distinction. But I'm not the one who needs... Grace, Tommy's voice, quiet. She turned to look at him and he was watching her with an expression that was very old for a face that age, or perhaps very young, she couldn't decide which. You fed me when you didn't have to. You drove into a blizzard when you didn't have to. You gave us your house, and your bourbon, and your neighbor's plow truck, and your connections, and your warmth. His jaw was tight. Let us do one thing for you, please. I've been trying to do one thing for you for 6 years. The room was very still. Grace Turner looked at the faces around her. Marcus, sitting down against his will, arms crossed, watching her. Elena, arms folded, waiting with the patience of someone who has decided the outcome and is simply allowing time to confirm it. Dr. Park, pen still in hand, observing over his half-made list. Ricky, the others, Darnell, Tommy. She thought about the heating bill she had been calculating in installments. She thought about the roof over the back bedroom that she had been ignoring because there was no version of the numbers that made fixing it possible this year. She thought about the prescription she had been splitting in half to make it last longer and had not told her doctor because what was the point of telling someone about a problem that neither of you can solve? She thought about Peter, who would have said, Grace, for heaven's sake, let someone help you. She knew the exact voice he would have used. She heard it as clearly as if he were in the room. Okay, she said. It was the same word she had said to Darnell on the road the night before. Calm, certain, no drama, just the thing itself. But this time she was saying it to receive something, and that was different and harder, and she acknowledged that privately while keeping her face steady. Darnell exhaled, the sound of an enormous amount of tension finding somewhere to go. Okay, he echoed. But I have a condition, Grace said. Darnell waited. This town needs what you've been doing on that route, not just for the communities to the north, here. The people in this county. I've got neighbors who drive 90 minutes to see a doctor because there is no doctor here. I've got people on this road who are managing conditions on the phone with a nurse line because that's all there is. She looked around the room, at the credentials and the training and the 19 people who had been trying to solve exactly this problem from the outside in. I want a clinic here, not a delivery point, a clinic. I'll help run it. I'll find the space. I'll do whatever needs doing. She paused. But I want this town to be on the route. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then Dr. Park put down his pen and said, very quietly, I've been trying to make the case for exactly that for 18 months. To whom? Grace asked. To anyone who would listen. He looked at her with those careful eyes. I haven't found the right person to listen yet. You found her, Darnell said. He was smiling. The full version, not the small private one, and it transformed his entire face the same way the small one had transformed Marcus's. You absolutely found her, Elena said. I can write the medical authorization documentation. Park, if you draft the Community Health Needs Assessment, I can have a formal proposal to the State Rural Health Office by the end of the month. I know the county board, Grace said, 3 of them personally. Doug Kettler will back it. He told me this morning he would do anything I asked, and I intend to take that seriously. The chapter can fund the initial equipment, Darnell said. We've got the foundation structure. We just need the community anchor. He looked at Grace. She looked back at him. You're looking at her, she said. And the thing that happened in the room in that moment was not dramatic. There was no single sound, no gesture, no speech. It was quieter than that and more lasting. The feeling of something shifting from potential to real, from almost to actual, from the shape of a thing to the thing itself. 19 people and one woman in a house on Route 46 in the aftermath of a Montana blizzard, deciding together that the night that had nearly destroyed them was going to build something instead. Tommy reached out from where he sat against the wall and touched Grace's arm, just briefly, the way a child reaches for a familiar hand in an unfamiliar place. She covered his hand with hers. Outside, the storm was finally done. Tommy and Darnell left at 10:30 with the supply bags redistributed across 2 bikes and Carl's truck trailing behind them like a promise kept. Grace stood at the door and watched them go without waving, because waving felt too small for what she was feeling, and she had never been a woman who reached for gestures when the real thing was available. She just watched until the sound of the engines faded into the new quiet that a post-blizzard Montana morning makes. That specific, almost holy silence of a world that has been through something and come out the other side. Then she turned back inside. The work of the day didn't pause for sentiment. Elena had the county health office on the phone within the hour, following up the supply authorization with a preliminary inquiry about the clinic proposal. Her voice through the kitchen wall was crisp and relentless, in the particular way of someone who has learned that systems respond to persistence the way ice responds to pressure, slowly, then all at once. Dr. Park sat at Grace's kitchen table with her notepad, rebuilding the community health needs assessment from memory and asking Grace questions she hadn't expected to be able to answer but found, to her own surprise, that she could. How many residents over 60? How many children without a local pediatric provider? How many families she knew personally who had delayed treatment because of the drive? She knew. She had been living inside this gap for 30 years. She had just never been asked to describe it out loud in terms that anyone with authority might act on. "You should have been the one writing this report," Park said at some point, not looking up from the page. "Nobody asked me," Grace said. Park looked up then. "I'm asking you now." She pulled up a chair and sat down across from him, and they worked together for 2 hours, Grace talking and Park writing, and what emerged on the pages of her notepad was something that had always existed in the lived reality of her county, but had never had a shape that anyone in an office building could hold. A clear, specific, devastating picture of what it meant to be sick in a place that had been decided against. Ricky found them there at noon and set 2 bowls of soup on the table without comment. He had been cooking from Grace's remaining pantry with the same improvising resourcefulness that seemed to characterize everything these people did, turning canned tomatoes and dried pasta and the last of her chicken stock into something that was genuinely good. Grace ate without stopping her conversation with Park, and realized only after she finished that she hadn't eaten a real meal since the night before. Ray called out from the living room. His voice was strong, stronger than it had any right to be, Grace thought, for a man who had been barely breathing when she covered him with her blanket on Route 46 in the dark. She went to him. He was sitting up fully, back against the couch, and his face was clear, still marked by the night, still tired in a deep-down way, but present and sharp-eyed and carrying something he clearly needed to say. "I need to thank you," he said. "You don't," Grace said. "Mrs. Turner," he looked at her directly. "I have a daughter. She's 9. Her name is Lily." His voice stayed level, but just barely. "I was thinking about her when Darnell found me. I actually thought," he stopped, collected himself with the visible effort of a man who does not cry easily, and was close to it anyway. "I need you to know that Lily is going to grow up with her father because of you. I need you to know that I know that." Grace sat down beside him on the floor the way she had sat beside Tommy the night before. At his level, close enough that he didn't have to project the words. "Tell me about Lily," she said. And he did. For 20 minutes, Ray talked about his daughter, her laugh, her opinions about dogs, the way she read with a flashlight under her covers and thought he didn't know. He talked about her the way fathers talk about daughters they have almost lost access to forever, and are still adjusting to the fact that they haven't. Grace listened the way she had always listened, which was with her whole body, with her full attention, with the deep, patient warmth of a woman who understood that being heard is sometimes the most medical thing you can offer a person. When he finished, he said, "You have grandchildren?" "4," Grace said. "2 in Missoula and 2 in Oregon." "Do they know what you did last night?" Grace thought about this. "Not yet," she said. "They should," Ray said. "They should know exactly who their grandmother is." She left him there and went to the back bedroom, Peter's old office, the one with the roof she'd been ignoring, and she sat on the edge of the bed and she called her daughter in Missoula. The call she had been putting off since the night before because she hadn't had the words yet, or the time, or the emotional reserve to open that particular door without knowing if she had enough left to hold the conversation properly. Her daughter answered on the first ring, the way she always did when it was Grace, the specific alertness of a child who has been half listening for their parents' call without admitting it to themselves. "Mom, I tried you last night and this morning. The roads, I thought." "I'm fine," Grace said. "I'm more than fine. I need to tell you something." She told her, all of it, start to finish, in the same direct, unadorned way she had told Doug Kettler and Carl Briggs. No performance, no softening, just the sequence of what happened. Her daughter was silent for long enough that Grace checked twice that the call hadn't dropped. Then her daughter said, Mom, you went back out 3 times? In the Malibu?" "The heater held," Grace said. "I'm going to be sick," her daughter said, which was the most affectionate thing she knew how to say when she was frightened, and Grace recognized it as such. "Don't be sick. Listen, I need you to know something." Grace paused, choosing her words. "I've been very quiet here since your father died. Too quiet. I think I told myself it was grief, and it was. But it was also, I got small, sweetheart. I got careful in ways Peter never would have let me get careful if he'd been here." She stopped. "Last night reminded me of who I am, and I need you to not worry about me the way you've been worrying, because I'm about to be very busy and very much myself, and the thing you should actually be worried about is whether Doug Kettler can keep up." Her daughter laughed. It was a watery, overwhelmed, thoroughly relieved laugh, and it was the best sound Grace had heard all day, including the moment Tommy's fever broke. "Tell me about the clinic," her daughter said. So Grace told her that too. By the time she came back out, 3 things had happened. Elena had gotten a preliminary, favorable response from the State Rural Health Office, who had apparently been waiting for exactly this kind of organized community request to justify a pilot program funding release they'd had sitting unused for 11 months. Ricky had found Grace's old church directory in the kitchen drawer and had, without being asked, started calling every community organization listed as a potential network for patient outreach. And Marcus with his cracked ribs and his fractured wrist, whom Elena had ordered to sit down, was standing at Grace's kitchen counter, writing out, in careful left-handed print, because the right wrist was the broken one, a detailed equipment list for a functional rural clinic with cost estimates and vendor contacts and a prioritized procurement schedule. Elena came in, saw him standing and said, "Marcus." "I'm standing, not riding a motorcycle," he said without looking up. "These are different things." Elena opened her mouth, closed it, looked at Grace. "Don't look at me," Grace said. "I've learned not to argue with people who know what they need to do." The afternoon moved fast. Carl came back from the supply run at 3, reporting that the delivery had been completed. All 3 communities reached, all critical patients supplied, the clinic at the reservation community restocked. He delivered this information the way Carl delivered all information, which was factually and without decoration. But Grace had known him for 30 years, and she could read the particular set of his shoulders that meant he had been moved by something and was processing it privately in the way men of his generation and geography had learned to do. "The woman at the first community," he said, "she came out in the cold to help carry the bags. She had an insulin pen in her coat pocket that was almost empty. She kept saying thank you, and she kept. He stopped, cleared his throat. Anyway, Tommy knows what he's doing on that route. Yes, he does, Grace said. Tommy called at 4. His voice on the phone was different from the fever voice she had heard in the morning. Cleaner, more like itself, carrying the particular quality of someone who has completed something they've been working toward for a very long time. All 3 stops, he said. Everyone reached. Mrs. Clearwater at the Res Community says to tell you. She doesn't know who you are, but she says tell the woman with the house that her prayers are specific and they work. A pause. I told her your name. She's going to write you a letter. Grace pressed her free hand flat against the kitchen wall and breathed. Come back carefully, she said. Yes, ma'am, Tommy said. And in those 2 words, she heard the echo of a 7-year-old boy who had said the same thing to her across a lunch tray 30 years ago. The same quiet acknowledgement from someone learning that it was safe to be grateful, that the person in front of them would still be there for the next ask, and the one after that. She kept her hand on the wall for a moment after she hung up. Then she walked back to the kitchen table, sat down across from Park, picked up the pen, and said, Where were we? They were at the section on access barriers. They finished it in an hour. When they were done, Park looked at the pages assembled in front of them and said nothing for a long moment. Just looked. The way you look at something when you are trying to fully believe it is real. This is going to change things, he said, concretely, meaningfully. This document, this proposal, the contacts we have, this is going to change things for people in this county. It's going to try, Grace said. No, Park said. He met her eyes with the directness he applied to everything, the careful precision that had spent a career measuring the gap between what was and what should be. It's going to succeed. I've been in this field long enough to know the difference between something that has a chance and something that has momentum. This has momentum. He paused. You have momentum. Grace looked at him. She thought about the word, momentum, a physics word, a word about things already in motion, things that carry their own forward force, things that don't stop easily once they've started. She thought about 3 trips in a blizzard. She thought about cornbread. She thought about a scar on her palm and a photograph kept for 6 years and a boy who had built a medical supply route across rural Montana because one cafeteria worker had looked at him like he mattered. She thought about what Peter would say if he could see her kitchen table right now, covered in notes and lists and the beginning of something real. 19 people breathing in her house who might not have been, a clinic that was going to happen because she had decided it would. She knew exactly what he would say. She heard it so clearly it almost wasn't memory anymore. It was presence. He would say, There she is. That's my Grace. There she is. She straightened in her chair. She squared the pages in front of her. She had spent 3 years learning to live in a quiet house. She had learned it completely, carried it faithfully, honored what it asked of her. But she understood now, with the clarity that only arrives after something has cracked you fully open and let the air in, that quiet is not the same as small, and grief is not the same as stopped, and the life still ahead of her was not a remainder, it was a continuation, and it was full, and it was hers. Grace Turner had driven into a Montana blizzard to save 19 strangers because she could not live with herself if she didn't. What she had not known, what no one could have told her on that dark stretch of Route 46 in the howling cold, was that the act of saving them would reach back through 30 years of her own life and show her, precisely, irrefutably, in the faces of the people now filling her home, that every small kindness she had ever given without expectation of return had been a seed, and that she had been living, without knowing it, in the middle of a garden. She had saved 19 people, and every single one of them, in their own way, had saved her right back.